The morning Prince William walked into the drawing room of Clarence House and calmly announced that he had become the sole legal owner of Cedar Estate. The entire architecture of the modern British monarchy shifted on its axis in a single silent heartbeat. He did not shout. He did not tremble. He did not offer a single word of explanation to the woman sitting across from him in her pale rose cardigan, her teacup suspended halfway between saucer and lip, her eyes widening with the slow dawning horror of someone who has just realized that a war she believed she was quietly winning had in fact been lost years ago by her opponent's grandmother. For over 8 decades, Cedar Estate had existed as one of the most fiercely guarded secrets in the private portfolio of the House of Windsor, a property acquired in the darkest hours of the Second World War, hidden behind layers of shell companies, trust deeds, and cryptic land registry filings that only 3 living people in the world had ever been permitted to read in full. And now, on this cold gray Tuesday morning, the young Prince of Wales had shattered decades of institutional silence, broken a sacred vow of discretion imposed by his late grandmother, and revealed that the entire estate, every acre, every artifact, every locked vault beneath its cedar-lined floors, belonged to him and him alone. What exactly had Queen Elizabeth II foreseen, in those final quiet years of her reign, that compelled her to draft a legal instrument so airtight that even the crown itself could not undo it? Why had she explicitly forbidden any mention of Cedar Estate in the presence of Camilla or her son Tom Parker Bowles? And what devastating hidden tragedy, buried within the estate's cedar-paneled archives, had finally forced William to break his silence and claim what his grandmother had spent a lifetime preparing for him alone? The revelation did not come from a press briefing, nor from a carefully worded palace communique polished to blandness by a battalion of gray-suited advisors. It came instead in a cavernous, hauntingly quiet library nestled deep within the eastern wing of Cedar Estate itself, a place so obscure, so deliberately absent from every published map of royal holdings, that even seasoned royal correspondents had gone their entire careers without ever hearing its name whispered aloud. The estate stood on the wind-scoured edges of the Cotswold Escarpment, its long gravel drive flanked by ancient cedars planted, according to a faded groundskeeper's ledger, by a Prussian gardener in the winter of 1943. On this particular morning, a pale watery light filtered through the mullioned windows of the library, catching the drifting dust motes that danced above a mahogany reading desk older than the Union of the Crowns. The scent of aged paper, beeswax polish, and something faintly medicinal, the particular perfume of a room that has kept its secrets for generations, hung in the air like a held breath. And on the desk, illuminated by a single brass reading lamp, lay a cream-colored envelope sealed with a swallow-shaped wax crest the color of dried blood. The envelope was addressed, in Queen Elizabeth II's unmistakable copperplate hand, to only one person on earth, *to my grandson William, to be opened only when the machinery moves against you. William stood at the desk with his hands braced against the mahogany, his knuckles gone white with the strain of a decision he had rehearsed in his mind for nearly 2 years. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and growly, weighted with the exhaustion of a man who had carried this secret through his mother's funeral, through his grandmother's funeral, through his father's coronation, and through every diplomatic smile he had been asked to offer the woman now installed as queen consort. For 82 years, he said quietly, addressing the small semicircle of legal witnesses gathered around him, the world has spoken about my grandmother's legacy, about what she wanted, about what she would have chosen. Today, at last, I am speaking for her. A tall, angular man in a charcoal suit, the keeper of Her late Majesty's private muniments, an office so obscure it did not appear in any published register of royal appointments, pressed a trembling hand to the leather portfolio at his side, sweat beading faintly along his temple despite the biting December cold seeping through the ancient walls. Behind him, 2 senior barristers from the Duchy of Cornwall's private legal counsel stood with the stiff mortuary posture of men who understood that whatever was about to unfold in this room would rewrite the balance of power inside the House of Windsor for a generation. And somewhere, in a small operations suite 3 floors above them, a discreet encrypted feed was already relaying the proceedings to a single secure server in Edinburgh, a fail-safe Queen Elizabeth herself had commissioned in the last winter of her life, designed to activate the instant Cedar Estate's ownership was formally transferred. To understand what was happening in that library, one had to travel back through the corridors of memory, back through the muffled decades of Windsor silence, back to a specific afternoon in the late summer of 1997, when a slender 10-year-old boy in a gray wool jumper had sat cross-legged on the Persian rug in Balmoral's small drawing room, listening to his grandmother speak in a voice unlike any she had ever used before. The scent of white gardenias drifted in from the corridor. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed the quarter hour with its familiar bronze weight, and Queen Elizabeth, still in the raw, disbelieving days that followed his mother's death, had reached out with a hand that was uncharacteristically unsteady and taken his small fingers in her own. "William," she had said, her voice low and unadorned. "There are things in this family that must be protected from the people who wear its name. One day, when you are older, I will show you a place. It has cedars along the drive. Do you remember the cedars we walked beneath at Sandringham?" He had nodded, mute, his eyes still swollen. "Good," she had said. "Then you will remember cedar." She had never spoken of it again in his childhood. But every August, without fail, a small card had arrived in his private mail at Eton, and later at St. Andrews, bearing only 3 words in her copperplate hand. Asterisk, "The Cedars remember." He had not understood then. He understood now. The estate itself had been acquired in the darkest winter of 1943, at a moment when the British Crown, exhausted and battered by the machinery of total war, had been quietly offered a rural property in the West Country by a childless Anglo-Prussian widow, whose family had begged the Crown to shelter their generational archive from Nazi looters on the continent. The transaction had been arranged not through the Crown estate, nor through the Duchy of Lancaster, but through a private trust registered under a bland corporate shell in the Channel Islands, the sort of instrument no historian would ever bother to unearth. The property had been placed in the personal care of the then Princess Elizabeth herself, aged just 17, as a training ground in the discreet, patient stewardship of hidden things. From that moment onward, Cedar Estate had grown, quietly and invisibly, into one of the most extraordinary private archives in Europe, a repository of wartime letters exchanged between the royal family and their continental cousins, personal recordings made by King George VI in the final weeks of his life, uncatalogued Fabergé miniatures, a small but priceless collection of Van Dyck sketches recovered from a Belgian convent in 1946, and, most guarded of all, a series of sealed cassette recordings made by Diana, Princess of Wales, in the last 18 months of her life. It was, in every meaningful sense, the shadow archive of the 20th century monarchy. And now it belonged, in its entirety, to a 31-year-old man in a navy overcoat standing in a cold library on a Tuesday morning. The men who would have preferred it otherwise had names, of course, but names in the theater of the British establishment meant far less than roles. There was the senior courtier who had served 3 sovereigns, whose polished Oxford shoes had trod the corridors of Buckingham Palace, Clarence House, and Windsor, with the noiseless efficiency of a man who understood that true power was never held by those whose faces appeared in the newspapers. He wore charcoal, always charcoal, and carried a slim leather clipboard beneath his left arm, as if it were a ceremonial sword. His eyes were the pale gray of a Scottish loch in November. And it was said, though never in writing, that he had personally reviewed every piece of correspondence sent to and from the Princess of Wales in the 18 months preceding her death. He was one of the men in gray, the invisible architects, the ones who did not sit upon thrones but drafted the memoranda that thrones obeyed. And he had for nearly a decade been quietly cultivating the ambitions of Camilla Parker Bowles and her son Tom, whispering into their ears about the extraordinary commercial potential locked away behind Cedar Estate's cedar-lined walls. A boutique heritage brand, he had suggested, a high-end publishing imprint, a curated auction of duplicate artifacts, a television documentary, a licensing arrangement with a luxury fashion house. The estate, he had murmured over years of small, careful lunches, was simply too valuable to remain a mausoleum. The Crown, he had reasoned, deserved to monetize its own memory. What none of them had understood, what neither the men in gray nor Camilla nor her son had ever suspected, was that Queen Elizabeth II had watched all of it. Every lunch, every whispered proposal, every quiet reconnaissance visit that Tom Parker Bowles had made to the estate under the guise of family curiosity in the autumn of 2019. She had seen it, and she had prepared. In the final 3 years of her reign, working with a single trusted solicitor in Lincoln's Inn, a man whose own father had drafted the original 1943 trust, the Queen had systematically dismantled every legal pathway by which Cedar Estate could be absorbed into the general Crown holdings upon her death. She had transferred the property, layer by careful layer, into a private trust whose sole beneficiary was named in a document sealed within the very envelope now lying on the mahogany desk. She had done this quietly. She had done this without ever informing her son, the then Prince of Wales. And she had done this, above all, without ever informing the woman he would one day install beside him as queen. The dust motes drifted, the clock in the corridor ticked, and William, standing at the desk with his grandmother's envelope beneath his palm, reached for the small silver letter opener that had been laid ceremonially beside it. The crack of the wax seal breaking was, in the perfect stillness of that library, as loud as a rifle shot. He unfolded the letter with slow, deliberate care. 3 pages, cream-colored, watermarked with the small, unobtrusive swallow that had been his grandmother's private emblem since childhood. A bird, she had once told him, in the gardens of Sandringham, flies where it wishes, and answers to no cage. The date at the top of the first page was written in her unmistakable hand. *2 ND September 2021 *, less than a year before her death. He read the first line, and his breath hitched audibly in the silence. *My dearest William. If you are reading this, then the machinery has moved. I am sorry. I had hoped it would not. Within you. He read on. And as he read, the color drained from his face in a slow ashen tide. His grandmother had not merely predicted that Camilla's family would attempt to claim Cedar Estate. She had named the exact date on which the first legal probe would be filed against the trust. She had written it in her own hand. In the autumn of 2021, between the 9th and 14th of December, 2024, a formal query will be lodged through the office of the Keeper of the Privy Purse, requesting clarification of the beneficial ownership of the Cedar property. The query will be routed through a junior clerk to disguise its origin. The true author of the query will be a senior courtier, working at the instruction of the Queen Consort's family, though not necessarily at her personal instruction. Do not respond to the query, do not acknowledge it. The trust will speak for itself. William looked up slowly from the page. His eyes met those of the keeper of the monuments. The man's face had gone the color of old parchment. The query, the keeper rasped, his voice barely audible, was filed on the 11th of December, 3 days ago, by a junior clerk in the office of the Privy Purse. Acting on instruction from, he did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. 20 million people were not yet watching. The encrypted feed still held its silence. But somewhere in a small terraced house in Edinburgh, the single technician assigned to monitor the failsafe server had already reached for the red telephone on his desk. Because embedded within Queen Elizabeth's trust instrument was a clause so extraordinary, so unprecedented in the annals of British private law, that the solicitors in Lincoln's Inn had spent 6 months arguing over its enforceability before the Queen herself had settled the matter with a single sentence. *Draft it. I shall sign it. The rest is not your concern. The clause stipulated that in the event of any formal legal challenge to the trust by any member of the Windsor or Parker Bowles families, the entire archive was to be made available, in curated, redacted form, to the British public through a series of controlled broadcasts, to be released via secure satellite uplink to the BBC, ITV and Sky News simultaneously. The Queen had in effect built a doomsday device into her own legacy, and Camilla's family had just tripped it. William folded the letter with the same slow deliberation with which he had opened it. He placed it, along with the second and third pages, into a small leather portfolio that the keeper handed to him with visibly trembling hands. Then he turned, very slowly, to the tall lattice window at the far end of the library, and looked out at the ancient cedars swaying in the December wind. His breath fogged the cold glass. "How long?" he asked quietly, "before the feed goes live?" 48 hours, sir, unless the challenge is formally withdrawn. William did not turn from the window. It will not be withdrawn. He was right. Because at that very moment, in a very different room, the small private sitting room of Ray Mill House in Wiltshire, where Camilla had retreated for what her staff described as a quiet weekend of family reflection, Tom Parker Bowles was pacing before the fireplace with a mobile phone pressed to his ear, his face flushed, his voice rising into the strained falsetto of a man who had just been informed that a business plan he had spent 4 years quietly assembling had, in a single morning, been rendered legally impossible. "What do you mean he's the sole owner?" he was demanding of the senior courtier on the other end of the line. "What do you mean the trust is airtight? You told my mother, that the old Queen had never signed the final—" The courtier's voice, thin and metallic through the receiver, cut across him with the practiced calm of a man who had spent 30 years managing crises far worse than this. "She signed it, Thomas. In February of 2022. Witnessed by 2 members of her personal household. Filed with the trust registry 3 days before her final journey to Balmoral. There is no undoing it. There never was." Tom Parker Bowles sat down very heavily on the arm of a chintz sofa, his mother's chintz sofa, and stared into the fire as the full scale of what had been quietly, patiently, ruthlessly engineered against them by a woman who had smiled at him at Christmas dinners for 20 years began, at last, to reveal itself. The plans had been elaborate. He had already met, in the discreet back rooms of members' clubs in St. James, with a boutique publishing house prepared to offer 7 figures for a limited edition photographic volume drawn from the Cedar archive. He had had preliminary conversations with a Bond Street auction house about a carefully curated sale of what he had described as surplus items of ambiguous provenance. A luxury cashmere brand had expressed interest in a heritage collaboration built around the swallow motif his mother had, in an unguarded moment at a Chelsea dinner, described as a delightful little emblem in the family archive. A production company in Notting Hill had already drafted a treatment for a 6-part streaming documentary provisionally titled *The Hidden Windsor. All of it, every deal, every letter of intent, every carefully aligned dominoes, depended on Cedar Estate passing, upon Queen Elizabeth's death, into the general portfolio of the Crown, where his mother, as Queen Consort, would have quiet, informal, unofficial but very real influence over its stewardship. And now, in the course of a single Tuesday morning, all of it had collapsed into the ruthless machinery of a trust instrument drafted in Lincoln's Inn by a woman most of the world had considered too old, too grieving, too traditionally decorous to understand the modern art of quiet institutional warfare. They had underestimated her. Catastrophically. And they were not the first. In the flickering firelight of Ray Mill House, Tom Parker Bowles reached slowly for the tumbler of whiskey his mother's housekeeper had set beside him an hour earlier. The ice had long since melted. He drank it anyway. Back at Cedar Estate, William had moved from the library to a smaller adjoining chamber the estate's original architects had called the Cedar Room, a low-ceilinged, oak-paneled space lined floor-to-ceiling with the pale honey-toned cedarwood shelving that gave the property its name. It was here, along the north wall behind a Van Dyck sketch of a young unknown boy, that a hidden compartment had been built into the wainscoting in the summer of 1944. William approached the sketch slowly. He removed it from its brass hooks with practiced care. For his grandmother, in the last year of her life, had walked him through this precise sequence of gestures on 3 separate occasions, making him rehearse them until they were as instinctive to him as tying a tie. He pressed the hidden panel to the left of the empty hook, and the mechanical click of the compartment releasing was small, precise, and infinitely final in the hush of the room. Inside lay a slim silver box, no larger than a paperback novel, engraved on its lid with a single small swallow. And within the box, cushioned in cream velvet, lay a cassette tape, and a small brass cipher key. The cassette tape was labeled in Diana's own handwriting, * for William, when you are strong enough. He stood for a long moment looking down at the tape. 26 years collapsed, in that single moment, into the breath of a single indrawn breath. He was 10 years old, and 31, and every age between, all at once. He was a boy who had walked behind a gun carriage through the streets of London while a nation wept. He was a young man who had knelt at his grandmother's coffin in Westminster Hall. He was a father whose own children had never met the grandmother who would have adored them beyond reason. And here, at last, in a small silver box in a cedar-paneled room in a house whose existence had been kept secret from 99% of the family whose name it bore, his mother was waiting to speak to him. He did not play the tape then. He was not yet ready. Instead, he placed it back within the box, closed the compartment, rehung the Van Dyck, and turned to the keeper of the monuments. "Have the forensic panel authenticate the cassette by close of business tomorrow," he said. "Voice pattern analysis, magnetic tape composition, handwriting on the label. I want no ambiguity, nothing that can be dismissed as fabrication when the men in gray begin their next campaign." "Yes, sir." "And the cipher key?" "For the second archive, sir, the one your grandmother described in her final months. It opens the vault beneath the east cellar." William nodded slowly. "Tomorrow, then." He walked out of the cedar room and back through the library, and as he did, the cold December light caught the edge of the swallow-shaped wax seal still lying on the mahogany desk. He paused. He picked it up. He turned it over in his fingers, and for the first time that morning, something like a faint, sad smile touched the corners of his mouth. He was thinking of Sandringham. He was thinking of gardenias. He was thinking of a small card that had arrived every August at his boarding school. * The Cedars remember. He slipped the wax seal into the breast pocket of his overcoat, close to his heart, and walked out into the cold Cotswold morning. That evening, at approximately 9 minutes past 7, an antique rotary phone rang in the small study of Cedar Estate's east wing. The sound of it, the specific jangling brass ring of a telephone that had been installed in the property in 1948 and never once been replaced, startled the 2 barristers who had remained on site to draft the formal response to the Privy Purse's inquiry. William, who had been sitting alone by the fire with a glass of untouched brandy, rose slowly and crossed the room. He lifted the receiver. The voice on the other end was fractured, hollow, stripped entirely of the sovereign authority that its owner was in every other context required to project. "Willie. Harry. I saw it. The clause, the BBC feed, the archive release protocols. There was a long shuddering pause. The voice that came next was no longer that of a 39-year-old man in a California mansion. It was the broken sob of a 15-year-old boy in a black funeral suit, standing behind a gun carriage. "She left something for me too, didn't she?" William closed his eyes. He gripped the edge of the desk. "Yes. Grandma left a letter for each of us, different letters, different instructions. Yours is here. It has your name on it, in her handwriting." When? When you can come, when you're ready. Another long silence. Then, quietly, there's a swallow on hers, isn't there? Grandma's swallow. William did not trust himself to answer for a long moment. When he did, his voice was very quiet. Yes, Harold, there's a swallow. The line went dead. Somewhere over the North Atlantic, a private jet had already been chartered. The next 24 hours moved with the terrifying calculated precision of a machine that had been designed for exactly this moment and had waited, patient and silent, for 82 years to activate. The Privy Purse's inquiry was formally logged into the Trust's response system at 9:03 on Wednesday morning. The Trust, in accordance with the clause drafted in Lincoln's Inn in 2021, generated its automatic reply, a single-page document, sealed with the swallow crest, informing the Privy Purse that the beneficial ownership of Cedar Estate was, and had been since February of 2022, vested in a private trust whose sole beneficiary was HRH Prince William of Wales, and that any challenge to this arrangement would trigger the immediate release of the Cedar Archive Broadcast Protocol. The document was copied, as legally required, to the Keeper of the Privy Purse, to the Lord Chancellor's office, to the Trust solicitors in Lincoln's Inn, and, in a stipulation of Queen Elizabeth's own drafting, to the private secretaries of both the reigning king and the Queen Consort. At Clarence House, Camilla read the document in the small yellow drawing room she used for her private correspondence. She read it twice. Then she set it down very carefully on the walnut side table, folded her hands in her lap, and stared for a long time at the small watercolor of a spaniel that hung above the fireplace. She did not speak. She did not weep. She did not summon her private secretary. She simply sat, motionless, as the December light faded from the windows and the room around her filled with the slow, suffocating dusk of a woman who had just understood, in perfect and irrevocable clarity, that she had been outmaneuvered from beyond the grave by a woman who had smiled at her for 2 decades over Christmas dinner, and had never, not once, let her see the blade. The following morning, at Buckingham Palace, an emergency meeting was convened in the Belgian suite. In attendance, the King's principal private secretary, the Keeper of the Privy Purse, the Lord Chamberlain, 2 senior barristers from the Crown's private legal counsel, and, arriving late, his charcoal suit precisely pressed, his Oxford shoes silent on the polished floors, the senior courtier who had spent nearly a decade cultivating the commercial ambitions of the Parker Bowles family. He entered the room with the practiced ease of a man who had walked into rooms like this 1,000 times, and each time had walked out with the situation firmly under his control. He would not, this time, because sitting at the head of the table, in the chair traditionally reserved for the reigning sovereign, was Prince William of Wales, and spread before him, in careful chronological order, were photocopies of every memorandum, every internal note, every discreetly worded lunch confirmation, every carefully hedged brief on Cedar Estate's commercial potential that this particular courtier had drafted or received over the past 9 years. Queen Elizabeth II had not merely built a legal fortress around Cedar Estate. She had, quietly and patiently, built a paper trail sufficient to end the career of every man in grey who had conspired against it, filed, cross-referenced, notarized, kept, in triplicate, in a vault in Lincoln's Inn, in a bank in Zurich, and in a small locked safe in a farmhouse in Norfolk that appeared on no official register of royal properties. The courtier's face did not change as he sat down, but the small, almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw betrayed him to every man in the room. He was cornered. The trap had been set. He was, though he would not have used the word, terrified. William did not raise his voice. He never did in these situations, a discipline he had learned, though the courtier had never realized it, from watching his grandmother during the darkest weeks of the Annus Horribilis of 1992. "You have," William said quietly, "until the close of business on Friday to submit your resignation from every position you currently hold within the royal household. If you do so, the documents on this table will remain within the Trust's private archive. If you do not, they will be released, in accordance with Clause 9 of my grandmother's trust instrument, to the National Archives, to the Metropolitan Police's Special Enquiry Team, and to the Serious Fraud Office. The choice is yours. You have 48 hours. There was a very long silence in the Belgian suite. Somewhere, deep within the palace, a servant's bell chimed once and fell silent. The king, seated at the far end of the table in an armchair slightly apart from the proceedings, did not speak. He was watching his son, and there was in his eyes an expression that no one in the room, not even the senior barristers, could quite read. A mixture of grief and pride, and a species of quiet, private reckoning that would take him many months to resolve. The courtier bowed his head. "I understand, sir." "Good." The meeting adjourned at 11 minutes past 10. By noon, 3 separate letters of resignation had been received at the king's principal private secretary's office, the courtier himself, his deputy, and a junior clerk in the Privy Purse Office whose signature had appeared on the original inquiry filed on the 11th of December. By close of business Friday, 4 more resignations had followed. By the following Tuesday, the men in gray who had for years quietly steered Cedar Estate toward commercial exploitation had, one by one, silently and without public announcement, vanished from the corridors of the palace. Their departures were not reported. Their names did not appear in the press. But the corridors themselves seemed, in the weeks that followed, somehow lighter, as though some slow, patient, decades-long pressure that had built up within the walls had at last been released. At Raymill House, meanwhile, Camilla and her son had entered into what the household staff described, in low voices, as a period of considerable quiet. No comment was ever issued. No statement was ever released. No interview was ever granted. The boutique publisher was informed, through carefully worded intermediaries, that the projected volume would not, after all, be proceeding. The Bond Street auction house received a polite note declining further discussion. The Cashmere brand and the streaming production company were similarly, discreetly, and permanently rebuffed. And in the small yellow drawing room at Clarence House, Camilla began, for the first time in many years, to spend her afternoons reading. She did not read royal biographies. She did not read newspapers. She read, according to her lady-in-waiting, a great deal of Trollope. But this was not in the end a story about Camilla, nor about her son, nor about the men in gray. It was a story about a boy who had walked behind a gun carriage in September of 1997, and the grandmother who had reached for his small cold hand in a Balmoral drawing room and promised him, without ever saying it aloud, that one day she would give him a place where his mother could speak to him again. On a still, cold Sunday afternoon in the middle of January, William returned alone to Cedar Estate. He drove himself, in an unmarked Range Rover, without protection officers, without press, without staff. The cedars along the drive stood black against a low pewter sky. He entered the house through the west door, walked through the library, past the mahogany desk where his grandmother's letter had rested, into the cedar room, and removed the Van Dyck sketch from the north wall. He pressed the panel. The compartment released with its small, precise click. He took out the silver box. He carried the box down through the estate, along a narrow servants' corridor, down a flight of stone steps into the east cellar. There, at the far end of a long vaulted passage, stood a small oak door reinforced with iron bands, the sort of door one might find in an ecclesiastical crypt. He inserted the brass cipher key into its lock and turned it. The door opened onto a small chamber, no larger than a study, its walls lined with tall wooden filing cabinets, and at its center, a single leather armchair beside a small side table on which had been placed, decades before, a modest cassette player of 1980s vintage. His grandmother had ensured it was maintained annually. It worked perfectly. He sat down. He opened the silver box. He inserted the cassette into the player, and with a hand that no longer trembled, he pressed play. For a long moment, there was only the soft hiss of magnetic tape. Then, from a distance of 26 years, his mother's voice, clear, warm, unmistakable, filled the small stone chamber. Hello, my darling boy. If you are hearing this, then you are grown up now, and something has happened that I very much hoped would not. But you must not be afraid. You are not alone. Your grandmother knows where this tape is. She will make certain it reaches you. She and I have talked about many things, William, in the last few years, things I could not talk about with anyone else in the family. She has been very kind to me, kinder than the world will ever know. William closed his eyes. A single tear slipped down his cheek, catching the low amber light of the reading lamp. I want to tell you 3 things, my darling. First, none of what happened to me was your fault, nor Harry's, nor your father's. It was the doing of men whose names you may one day learn, and whose faces you will never trust. Second, your grandmother is a far braver woman than the world has ever been permitted to see, and if you are hearing this, it is because she has kept every promise she ever made to me. Third, the swallow flies where it wishes. Do you remember, my darling? The swallow flies where it wishes, and answers to no cage. Be the swallow, William, not the cage. And now, go and find your brother. Whatever has happened between you, go and find him. He is the only one who understands. He will always be the only one who understands. The tape hissed on for a few seconds longer. Then, softly, I love you, my darling boy. I always did. I always will. The player clicked off. William sat for a long time in the small stone chamber, the silver box open on his lap, the brass cipher key resting in his palm. He did not weep. He had wept, already, quietly, in the moment the tape had ended. What he felt now was something quieter, and older, and infinitely more difficult to name, the sense of a promise, made in a Balmoral drawing room in the raw grief of September 1997, finally and fully kept. When at last he rose, He returned the cassette to the silver box, placed the box within a small archival safe built into the wall of the chamber, locked it with the brass cipher key, and carried the key back up through the passages of Cedar Estate to the library. There, at the mahogany desk where his grandmother's letter had lain, he took a small envelope from the drawer, wrote on it in his own hand, * for Harry. When he comes *, placed the brass cipher key inside, sealed it with a fresh disc of red wax, and pressed into it the small swallow-shaped seal he had carried in his breast pocket since the morning of the 12th of December. He set the envelope on the desk. He turned out the brass reading lamp. He walked out of the library, out of the house, and into the pale winter afternoon, where the ancient cedars swayed against a low gray sky. Behind him, in the small operations suite 3 floors above the library, the encrypted feed to the secure server in Edinburgh was quietly and permanently deactivated. The doomsday device had done its work without ever needing to detonate. The archive would remain, as Queen Elizabeth II had always intended, private, a place of memory, not spectacle, a sanctuary, a vow kept. In the weeks that followed, Buckingham Palace issued no statement. Clarence House issued no statement. Kensington Palace issued no statement. The royal correspondents of Fleet Street, sensing something enormous had shifted within the family but unable to determine precisely what, filed a series of speculative articles that all missed the mark by a considerable margin. Across pubs in Edinburgh, in Cardiff, in Belfast, in the small market towns of the Cotswolds, pint glasses were raised and lowered without ceremony. Millions of screens flickered through the ordinary rhythms of an ordinary winter. The nation, unaware of what had just been quietly averted within its own institutions, went about its business. But in a small farmhouse in Norfolk, an elderly solicitor from Lincoln's Inn, the man whose own father had drafted the original 1943 trust, received a plain white envelope by second-class post. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored paper, watermarked with a small swallow, bearing 3 words in William's own hand. * The Cedars remember. The old solicitor read it once. He placed it in the fire. He watched it burn. And in California, a red-eyed man in a hooded sweatshirt sat on a sun-warmed patio staring out at a distant blue Pacific, his phone silent in his hand, waiting for the call that would tell him when to come home. It would come, in time. Not yet, but in time. The swallow, at last, had flown free. The broadcast, had there been one, would have cut here to black. There was no broadcast. There was only the wind moving through the ancient cedars, and a mother's voice speaking, at long last, in a small stone chamber beneath a house whose name the world had never been permitted to know. The truth had saved her boys. The secret was out, and yet it remained, as she had always wished it to remain, sacred.